Well, hello and welcome to this presentation in which we're going to cover the evolution of the X capability model or XCM within the ePerspectives digital enterprise method and framework. I'm Arsalan Rad. Let's get started. We will be first looking at the strategic capability model or SCM, which is the first uh, version, the first evolutionary stage, if you will, of the XCM. Let's remind ourselves a little bit about ePerspectives, and I've also included TOGAF because both of them sort of address similar things as I have shown in a separate presentation. I've talked about the differences and how ePerspectives is a method and framework that actually makes TOGAF implementable and much more precise as an actual guide. So on the ePerspective side, we have the key perspectives of business, enterprise, and change and operations separately. But in here, our focus is on the business perspective, which by itself has two sub-perspectives of business strategy and business design. So if we look at the first version or first evolutionary stage for XCM, which is an SCM or strategic capability model, this is where we will be looking at, first of all, what is our identity as a business organization, as an enterprise? What is it that we want to do? How do we interact with the outside world? How do we make ourselves unique? And basically, what are our key strategic capabilities and services? This will lay the foundation for everything else that we want to do in the future. Now, this is how we then use techniques such as canvas modeling, context modeling. Also, there's a lot of strategy work and such. What I always say is ask my colleagues who are working in strategy consulting piece is to distill what they have into a X matrix that we can relate the strategic capabilities to. I'll explain that in a moment. But this is a first version of the XCM, which is a strategic capability model where we basically try to define what do we want to do and be for the outside world, what are our key services and capabilities, and then make sure that we have a way to measure that value for them. And that is the X capability model. Moving forward, this is one example of it, and this is the from ETOM, from the telecommunications world, which is capability model. I'm not going to debate whether I agree with the way that they have gone about defining business strategic capabilities, but nevertheless, you can see it also here that however they defined it, whether sometimes focus more on services, sometimes more on capabilities. I always said that process, what we do comes first, so we can't possibly have capabilities without having thought about what we're going to do. So that's a key point to put to make a note of. And here you see some strategic capabilities, high level, such as marketing and sales and customer management and resource management and such. And then we have a different sub capabilities, if you will, for each one of them. And we use techniques such as business canvas modeling. This is where we look at ourselves, put ourselves in the center, and use a context diagram if you're familiar with that, and say, okay, who are the actors around us? What are the different parties we need to interact with? What is it? Which ones are partners? Which ones are suppliers? For example, how do we interact with them? What are the services they expect from us? What are our channels? And through that analysis, then we solidify our understanding of our strategic capabilities until our our strategic capability model becomes one that we can rely on and in fact baseline. So as I mentioned, it's important to relate our strategic capabilities to strategic business value. This is otherwise everything else that we will do from now on, unfold from now on, will be dependent on this. And if we can't measure them, we are by definition not a digital enterprise, because measuring in terms of business value, to say the least, is one of the most important necessities if we have a digital enterprise. And I also make this point that many may recognize the situation that we have, that there are pieces of strategic consulting that come normally very expensive and very impressive work with analysis of market and competitors and such, and balance scorecards and such, and this becomes an artifact, in my experience, that mostly, or I have seldom, or if ever, have seen that artifact actually becoming a baseline for everything else that unfolds in terms of our business, in terms of our enterprise and technology and people and organization. Normally, this is a document that is hard to understand and distill for the rest of the organization, and it's on a different abstraction level and cannot be connected to the rest. So this is where I always ask that, say, well, okay, if somebody's done that impressive consulting work on the strategy and defined our strategy, then they should hopefully be able to distill that into this X matrix. This is, well, you know, it doesn't have to be this. This is a good technique or a product from MIT's Enterprise Strategic Analysis and Transformation Methodology, ESAT. And this is a four-way matrix that maps strategic capabilities to stakeholder values, strategic objectives, but most importantly to KPIs, or key performance indicators, or metrics. So this is where we have to, through this mapping, from now on, we can have a value defined for every strategic capability. So as we do things, invest in it, change it, or do different things with it in future, at least we'll have a chance to know what is the business value in scope of whatever we're doing. This is another look at a strategic capability model mapped into an X matrix, and that's it. That's basically, for us, ends the part about strategic capability model, or SCM. In the next module, we will be discussing the enterprise, the business capability model, or BCM. So hello and welcome to this next session within the series of XCM, or evolution of X capability model, within the digital enterprise method and framework we call ePerspectives. I'm Arsalan Rad. In the previous session, we covered the left side of the blue perspective within ePerspective, which is the business strategy part. And we talked about how that one, we ignore everything else that is done internally, as the ePerspective methodology always advocates that whatever is internal to a perspective or sub-perspective is basically none of anybody else's business, and we don't want to bore people with those details, but the only thing is the output we provide to the next subsequent perspective or sub-perspective. In this case, the next subsequent sub-perspective is the business design sub-perspective. So all we had to do was the input, understand from the previous, all we need to understand really from the previous perspective of business strategy is the strategic capability model that you see in the middle. That's it. That's an input that we take in, and we need to work from that. We will not be bothered by how they did the analysis and what kind of techniques they used and such, which makes a very key importance in terms of clarifying things through separation of concerns. So going back to the 4 stages of the X capability model, we defined in the first stage in business strategy, we defined what we wanted to be to the outside world, and defined our key services and strategic capabilities, and essentially map them through an X matrix or whatever else technique we use. We map our strategic capabilities as minimum to KPIs or key performance indicators, but also possibly through an X matrix to strategic values as well as strategic objectives. This is hence why a strategic capability gets a business value, as mentioned. Now, coming to the next stage of business design, as I mentioned, the only thing that goes between the two of them, as you see with the dotted line, is in fact the strategic capability model. So we ignore anything else they did, or we not ignore, but we don't need to bother about it. So we look at here in terms of, we start with the strategic capability model in SCM, which clearly for us will tell us what we want to do to the outside world, what are our key capabilities and services that we need, and what is their key values, what is their business strategic value. Now we start from that as a foundation. We do things such as value stream, process modeling, process decomposition, and all those techniques. Also customer journey, which is very important to capture in tandem with value stream process analysis. And the processes, we extract from them cohesive set of sub-processes or services, if you will, and map them to their own business capabilities. So this is where we get a business capability model where cohesive services, for example, invoicing, inventory management, payment, and so on, everything within that service will be encapsulated there. And as I've mentioned here, a BCM is the true definition of business architecture. What does that mean? As I mentioned, defining architecture as the balancing act of fitting what we do, our services and processes, into a best fitting structure, right? So that is architecture. So business architecture, in this case, we are figuring out what we want our business to do and how we want to do it, right? And we map that into also the best structure. So therefore, a BCM is also the foundation for our future, if you will, business-driven, process-driven organization. So in this case, what we will be looking at the BCM, we will not be looking at implementation. As I mentioned before, BCM is agnostic to implementation. So we want to have that possibility to not be constrained by our constraints today. For example, we have budgetary constraints or technology or knowledge gap, but then we don't want that to constrain our business design, because we hope naturally that in future we will have a time where we will have better and more possibilities. So as I mentioned, we start with the enterprise capability model, do the analysis and process analysis and such, the techniques that we need to do, which we shield the rest of the world from. It's up to us because we're perspective based. And then eventually, after a few iterations of looking at our processes and looking at structure and running one through the other and see if it holds. And if it doesn't hold, remember again, the process is the master, the structure is the slave in a process-driven approach. That means we will, we can move around some of our capabilities or change their attributes and their relationships and such to best accommodate the spectrum of the processes and how we want our business to operate. It gives us an excellent means for doing heat mapping through different lenses, as I've mentioned. So this is one where we, for example, look at every capability. We can ask a number of different questions, such as, is this a critical capability for me? Am I lagging? Are my competitives better? Do I want to highlight this one as a very important capability? Okay, do I have people enough to do this, or do I want to outsource it to somebody else, insource it, who will do that? As you can see, it's an electronic map. When we have componentized things, it becomes far easier to address, to approach and analyze, rather than having the blob, as I mentioned before, like the old analog circuits in electronics where cables were going all over the place. So I have a couple of pages about some questions. We're not going to get into that, but you can see that we can use these types of questions, right, in terms of in different aspects, and use them in order to develop a solid business capability map that lays a foundation for what we will do in the next perspective, which is enterprise perspective. On that note, I'm going to thank you for this time, and in the next session we will be covering ECM. Thank you. Hello and welcome to this third presentation within the XCM presentation series, where we're talking about the evolution of the X capability model within the ePerspectives digital enterprise method and framework. And today we will be covering the ECM in this session, or the enterprise capability model. So looking at the ePerspectives, the enterprise perspective within the ePerspectives, what do we have? We have the enterprise IT sub-perspective, which looks at data application and technology architecture, but encapsulates them into its own sub-perspective, so others don't have to worry about it except how its output gets fed into the middle section, which is an enterprise capability model. Same thing with organization and resourcing. That is, we highlighted that is important to have incorporated and taken into account when we do a enterprise capability model. So we have talked about the 4 stages of evolutionary stages of XCM. Now we are at ECM. In short, we looked at SCM, where we try to see what we want to be to the outside world, what we want to do, how we want to be unique and different. And through that, we defined our strategic capabilities, high-level strategic capabilities, and found a mechanism to map them into business value, measurable business value as minimum through KPIs, or otherwise through a technique such as X matrix, where we also have a mapping to strategic values and strategic objectives. So this was what we want to do, what we want to be to the outside world. Then as we moved from business strategy sub-perspective to the business design sub-perspective, now we assume that we know high level what the business wants to do and be, and now we want to define a business operating model that best satisfies that. And as I mentioned, we start as default by the strategic capability model, do whatever analysis such as value stream analysis and process modeling, etc. And then eventually we have a business capability model which encapsulates our business architecture, but so our business operations, how it's going to be, but also it has a direct link, as you see there, to the strategy. So we will be able to measure all those business capabilities in terms of their strategic value. And as mentioned, we do that agnostic to implementation and deployment. When we do BCM, we will not be considering what technology, what IT, what people, and what constraints or we may have, because we are hoping that in future we should be able to have more possibilities. So this is where in order to make now the business capability model implementable and deployable, then this is the 3rd stage, which is in focus for us now, and this is ECM, or enterprise capability model. So what do we do here? We take the business capability model, which was agnostic to implementation, and then profile it from the point of view of its business strategy, relation to organization, to our IT and technology, as well as the dynamics of planning and portfolio and transformation planning. So we take all those into account and relate them to a capability, so that every capability is profiled from an enterprise perspective. And once we have these, we can have a great possibility to do a 360-degree fact-based analysis of every capability, which is here. As I've mentioned, this is the single most important artifact, not only within XCM, but period. And this is the ECM enterprise capability model, where business capability model becomes mapped, profiled, and baselined with 360-degree enterprise insight. How do we do that? So you can take any capability here. Take, for example, inventory management. It's a business capability, so as we said, it was agnostic to anything else. Now we look at and say, okay, we have defined before a business strategic value for you. So that we had that, so we can derive that. That's good. So we have profiled our inventory management from its value to the business, that characteristic. Now the next is we look at the organization aspect of it. That also entails locations. So for my inventory management, in what countries, what cities, what geographies do I have what people? Are they IT? Are they IT, or are they business people? Are they external vendors, our own people? What level of training you have? Any kind of profiling you want to do for the capability from an organization perspective. The third one is the important in enterprise IT and technology. This is where we then focus on. What are the applications, data, and technology in scope, but also we'll be able to look at through that, like, who are the vendors. So once we enter that sphere, we will be able to, through relationships that are there, to determine or obtain much more data and information. So when we know the vendor, then we can perhaps have defined what's our relationship to this vendor, what's our commitment for for a given application, for how long, how did we rate this vendor internally, and such. And the fourth aspect is the change portfolio. As I mentioned, it's an organizational resourcing part of it. That is to say, where are we doing this? What are the plans that we're having from an operation point of view? What are the projects that we're running right now that touch upon this? So, for example, a 360-degree analysis, as I've mentioned before, that several CIOs that I worked with refer to an ECM, especially if implemented by a tool, as you see some snippets here from one of the leading enterprise architecture tools called Alphabet from Software AG. You can use obviously all different tools for the ePerspective methodology, but Alphabet and Software AG have in fact adopted it and promoted it strongly and incorporated the methodology within their tooling. This is why you can even see some of the specific artifacts that are specific to ePerspectives available within Alphabet from Software AG. Enough of that. Let's move on. So if you have a good tool, and let's look at why a CIO refers to this as a command and control center. Yes, this is because this is a place where you can come on demand without needing to make arrangements and meetings and ask people, etc. You can come on demand, right, and have access, unique access to single version of truth, right? This is a single source. We don't let data or insight that has been captured within the ECM to be replicated or duplicated elsewhere, and people take it and do whatever they want with it, so that we don't know what has happened to that data anymore. We keep everything in this central repository, and people who have access to given data can extract that, but they will not be able to change it, or if they are going to change anything, it will be in full sync with the enterprise architecture function. This is why we maintain mutual integrity. And what does that mean? For example, I give you the clear example that I have seen in large organizations as a real example. Let's take, for example, billing, right? So you have a process called, for example, payment, right? You have some people working with payment, right? And you have some other people with something else, so like a internal, for example, registration for some courses, etc. Now, both of these projects, if you will, if people give projects to people like that, both of them will need to handle invoicing and billing, right? So now, what happens in many organizations is that since each one of these thinks that their project has their own goals and unrelated to the others, so they go themselves, since they have payments requirements, they go and define, billing requirements, they go and define a lot of requirements for billing and define services, and worse yet, they go and run off and even buy a package or an application, invest in it in order to satisfy their billing needs. But the same thing then happens from the internal course when we were doing payments, where we needed to do billing, for example, but that's a different, entirely different area. And if they also go and define their own billing requirements, and worse yet, go and buy another package, you can imagine how this can mushroom into a headache, right? But so this is crucial. I can't emphasize this enough, that we need to respect mutual integrity within a enterprise capability model. That is to say, you have a custodian, which is the enterprise architecture function. They will look at a given capability, and so if you're dealing with internal course management and you want to do anything on invoicing, you come and tell them, these are my requirements, these are the services I require to do invoicing. And they will look at the invoicing capability and see whether it has them. If it doesn't have them and it's justified, then they ask the the invoicing capability people to define that service. And it's only them who authorize buying a package or application development and such. So you see the importance of having a ECM as our single solid repository, central repository, where we maintain mutual integrity, and then see level executive, for example, who needs oversight. Let's take a COO who's usually concerned most with operational efficiency or costs. So if a COO, for example, many of them have cost saving as the biggest imperative. Okay, how do I cost save if I don't know the true value of an application? If somebody from the IT comes and tells me, okay, we want to, here's a proposal, let's replace these two applications which cost $6 million, for example, and replace them with these other two or three that cost 2 or 3 million. Well, that sounds straightforward. Okay, I'm saving 3 or 4 million, but hey, what am I undoing, right? So I might be doing something that other capabilities may depend on. I may bring in an application that I haven't taken into account what is the need for with the others, who else is using it and in what way. So what is the best way to do it for a COO to look at this? It would be like, okay, somebody give me a report about, okay, my as I mentioned, like billing, for example. Okay, so show me the services, and if you have a tool, you can do all this. Show me all the services that are there. Okay, show me their business value through the top left, right? So we can even click on this for the tool and enter that world of business strategy value where we are allowed and authorized. So this is very important. Not everybody has access to everything. If your role and profile has been defined to have that access, then you will click on a capability basically and be able to see its services, and then you can traverse and move into its strategic value side, and if needed, look at the strategic objectives and values and KPIs and such to get a better understanding of what is the business strategic value that I have for this capability. So, okay, so what are the services like billing? Okay, but what organization? What do we have? Do we have people in this country or in this location who can do that? Okay, now what applications, what packages do I have in billing? Show me the costs for them, but also tell me the commitment that I have to those vendors who sell them to me. And show me, by the way, an internal rating. How do we assess this vendor and such? So you have a, and as well, then you will be looking at, okay, what projects do I have in what locations currently that are working with billing or invoicing and doing something with invoicing and billing, and what applications are they changing, and where is those locations, who are the people involved, are those projects on track, what is the cost of those projects if I'm going to stop or continue them, and I also know the business value. So you can see that you can even extract, you can even have tailor-made reports that give you the data as a C-level executive exactly as you need. And mind you, this is your language. This is not in strange technology language or architectural terms, and this is, for example, this application has these specs and has these features and such, but you will be really doing your assessment based on true business case, right? So an optimization exercise that helps us do true cost saving without fixing something and basically creating mayhem in other parts of the organization. So we talked about these 4 different lenses that we look at from a business capability model. And so we have the business value, organization, IT technology, and portfolio, which also feeds off organization and resourcing indeed. So through that, then we do what is called a heat mapping analysis. So we look at every capability and simply ask the question, how important are you to us? How are you will you give me competitive edge, for example? So if I'm dealing with payroll, for example, as this picture shows, internal payroll, maybe that's not so important if we change and improve it, whereas our customer management module, for example, or CPQ or quoting and so on, those are important. They're not working. Other competitors are doing them better. So we then can come up with which ones are critical, which ones are like in the middle, and which ones are kind of we don't need immediately to change them. And based on this fully substantiated fact-based 360-degree analysis, then we are able to devise a transformation roadmap based on priorities and constraints. And this is why the ECM is considered the most important artifact within the ePerspectives framework. On that note, I would like to thank you for this session. In the next session, we will be covering the last part within ECM, which is SCM or which is a CCM or change capability model. Thank you. Hello and welcome to this final part of the XCM, the evolution of X capability model, in which case now we're going to, in this case, we're going to discuss and present CCM or change capability model. So as the previous modules, we look at the perspective that we have in scope. ePerspectives calls it change perspective. We remind ourselves of the fact that the only artifact that you need to concern yourself with, especially only, that is to say, if you're in the change perspective or in fact the enterprise perspective at a higher role as a higher role in the enterprise architecture, that you have a decisive say in here. The rest, they don't need to concern themselves with it. So that is only the change capability model. Everything else is the internals of these sub-perspectives. So this is change planning, and I have the correspondence site on TOGAF. As we have said before, that TOGAF brings a more generic approach, whereas ePerspective makes TOGAF implementable very precisely. So going back to our 4 stages of the XCM and capability model, again reminding ourselves that we had in the business strategy sub-perspective, which is within the business perspective, by the way. In the strategy perspective, we looked at what we want to be to the outside world and how we want to interact and what's our identity to the outside world, and therefore we will find out what are the services, how do we want to interact, and that gives us our strategic capabilities high level. And we talked about making them measurable by mapping them as minimum to key performance indicators or metrics, or to other attributes such as strategic objectives and strategic values. Therefore, we have high level strategic capabilities that are business measurable. Then we moved into the next stage, going to business design. The only thing that business design concerned itself with was not all the analysis and the way they worked and the canvas and such, but only the strategic capability model. As input that it comes to it becomes its default where it starts, that is high level. So then we start doing exercises such as value stream or value stream analysis modeling, process modeling, service decomposition, process decomposition and such. And also customer journey, context modeling. We are not going to bore because this is only relevant, these techniques are only relevant to whomever is within that sub-perspective indeed, which is business design perspective. Bottom line is, at the end of it, we will have a business capability model which is agnostic to implementation and deployment, and gives us the encapsulation of our business operating model, how we're going to operate from a business perspective, and in fact, how do we need to organize ourselves according to this business capability model in order to be a truly process-driven organization. Now, we talked about later coming to ECM. The most important of them is where we now bring and make the business capability model that was agnostic to implementation. Now we make it implementable and deployable. So what do? We look at every business capability. We look at the profile. What is the best optimized profile from a point of view of not only business value, which we have already established link to, but also from a point of view of organization and people, IT and technology, as well as our dynamic aspects of change and planning. And by doing, as I mentioned, a 360-degree fact-based analysis and assessment, we will look at the key areas in which we need to put focus. That's called a heat mapping exercise. And through that analysis, we will devise the key areas where we want to do first priorities in terms of our change and transformation roadmap. And now we're talking about CCM, which is simply a subset of ECM, where the changes need to be applied, where we have talked about those priorities, where we want to actually implement changes here. And based on that, then we devise plans and to go and implement changes. So It's simple. We look at every area and look at the priorities, importance of them. And this is what I mentioned before. We may look at an area, and before we might very well look at inventory management, for example, and we might have gone run amok and run outside and say, okay, no, this I want to do that better. So if somebody's selling a great package, if I bring that and if I hire those people, that will be great. I will be much better. But nobody's really said that this is a capability we want to invest in. Nobody said and done the analysis that this is a top level priority. And mind you also, we never do this in isolation. So we need to look at the entire capability map in order to make decisions about what is a priority as such. So we have done that through the heat mapping, looking at every capability and its importance. Then we devise a change roadmap or implementation roadmap that we will follow in order to implement accordingly. And this is the end slide, I believe, for the change capability model. On that note, I would like to thank you. I think that concludes all the modules for the XCM, X capability presentation. I thank you for the time. Look forward to the future sessions. Thank you.